My mother traded me for a new husband and wanted to kick me out of the house. When I left, I looked for a job and worked, but when I inherited $5 million, my mother sued me. When I was 14, my life took a sudden turn, and not in a good way. My mom, Joan, married a man named Richard, and suddenly, I had a new father and a new brother. Richard had a son, Thomas, who was a year older than me. At first, I thought this might be a fresh start, a chance for a more stable life for me and my mom. But it didn't take long for me to realize that things wouldn't go the way I hoped. The first few weeks after the wedding were tense but manageable. I tried to stay out of everyone's way, hoping to adjust slowly. Thomas and I barely spoke, but he seemed okay at first, quiet and a bit reserved. I figured we'd get along just fine if we just stayed out of each other's business. But that illusion was shattered pretty quickly. The hostility started with little things, or things that seemed little at the time. Richard had all these rules around the house, and he seemed obsessed with making sure I followed every single one to the letter, while Tom seemed to be exempt. If I left a plate in the sink, Richard would lecture me about responsibility. But if Tom did the same thing, silence. At first, I tried to brush it off. Maybe he just hadn't noticed, right? But it kept happening. Every time something went wrong in the house, all eyes seemed to fall on me. One evening, Richard stormed into my room, red-faced, holding a broken TV remote. He threw it onto my bed and demanded to know why I'd broken it. I hadn't even touched the thing, but he wouldn't listen. Tom was nowhere to be found, of course, and I realized he must have broken it and left it for me to take the blame. That was the first time I saw the pattern. Somehow, Tom always came out clean, while I was left carrying the weight of every problem in the house. Over time, it became clear that I wasn't just the new kid here. I was the family scapegoat. My mom tried to support me at first, but I could see her growing quieter, especially when Richard was around. If she tried to stand up for me, he'd give her this hard look, and she'd back down. The more he undermined me, the more she seemed to go along with it. It was like she was afraid of rocking the boat too much, afraid of losing whatever normal life she thought she'd finally gotten with him. One day, things took an even darker turn. I was working on a school project in my room, a big deal, worth half my grade. I'd stayed up late for weeks researching and putting it together. The night before it was due, I came back from a quick break and my project was gone. Papers scattered, books tossed, everything a mess. And there, standing in the doorway with a smug smile, was Tom. "Lose something?" he sneered, holding up a torn page from my project. My heart dropped. I tried to grab it from him, but he just laughed and shredded it right in front of me. When I yelled, Richard came running, and before I knew it, I was the one being yelled at for causing trouble. I tried to explain, to tell him what Tom had done, but he wouldn't even hear me out. He just told me I was irresponsible and needed to learn respect. That was the night I realized how powerless I was in this house. As months went on, it didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. Every time I tried to study or work, there'd be some distraction or accusation thrown my way. Tom seemed to enjoy making my life hell. He'd accidentally spill water on my school books or mess with my alarm clock so I'd be late. And if I ever tried to fight back, Richard would swoop in, accusing me of being the problem in the family. Mom would stand there, looking at her feet, avoiding my eyes. I felt so alone, trapped in a place that should have felt like home but was anything but. One afternoon, when I was trying to work on my resume to apply for a part-time job, Tom came into my room and started rifling through my stuff. I told him to get out, but he just smirked and threw my things on the floor, stepping on my papers. I snapped, pushing him back. We started shoving each other, and I ended up with a bruised arm. When Richard found out, he didn't even ask what happened. He grounded me for hurting Tom, even though I was the one left with the bruise. I saw Tom grinning behind him, knowing he'd won again. Eventually, I stopped trying. It felt like there was no point. I'd lock myself in my room whenever I could, avoiding everyone. I kept my head down, just trying to make it through each day. But the more I tried to fade into the background, the more Richard and Tom seemed to find ways to pull me back into their twisted games. They even started blaming me for things that happened when I wasn't even home, like the time the car's side mirror got busted while I was at school, and somehow, it was still my fault. I started feeling hopeless, like nothing I did would ever be good enough. Even if I got good grades or saved up my money, it didn't matter. Richard wouldn't let me have a moment of peace, and Tom made sure I couldn't even enjoy the small victories. My mom, who used to be my rock, seemed like a stranger, choosing Richard's side again and again, as if I didn't even matter. One night, I overheard a conversation between Mom and Richard. She was talking about wanting to send me to a boarding school. My stomach dropped, not because I didn't want to go. Honestly, I'd do anything to escape that house, but because of how easily she seemed to consider it, as if I was just some burden to be shipped away. When she saw me in the hallway later, she didn't meet my eyes. I realized then that she'd already made up her mind. The next few weeks were agonizing. Richard and Tom acted like I didn't exist, which, ironically, was almost worse than the constant blame. It was like they were waiting for me to disappear. Mom started talking about how boarding school could be a fresh start for me, not realizing, or maybe not caring, that it felt more like she was abandoning me. Finally, one evening, I decided to confront her. I asked her why she was letting them treat me this way, why she was willing to send me away. She looked at me with this sad, tired expression and just said, "Mark, I'm doing what's best for everyone." It felt like a punch in the gut. The woman who used to be my entire world had chosen them over me. That night, I packed a bag and left. I didn't know where I was going, but anywhere had to be better than that house. I walked down the quiet streets, the cold air stinging my face, and felt a strange sense of freedom, mixed with heartbreak. I knew I was on my own, but at least I wasn't living in a place where I was hated for existing. Looking back, I realized that leaving was the best decision I ever made. It took me years to rebuild, to find a sense of worth outside of what that family tried to make me believe about myself. But now, standing here today, I know I made the right choice. Growing up in that house, I quickly realized I was an outsider. It wasn't something that happened overnight. It built up slowly, like water filling a glass, until it finally overflowed. From the day my mom married Richard and Tom became my brother, I could tell I was only a guest in their home. Richard didn't treat me like his own. He tolerated me, and sometimes he didn't even bother doing that. Every small slip-up, every mistake, every time I was less than perfect, it felt like proof to them that I didn't belong. I wasn't family. I was just the kid Mom dragged along. When I started high school, I was desperate to fit in somewhere, anywhere. I threw myself into my studies, hoping that good grades would earn me some respect, maybe even a nod of approval from Richard. But that hope was quickly dashed. Richard didn't care if I aced a test or got straight A's. He only seemed to notice when I fell short. If Tom got a B, he'd get a "good job, son," and a slap on the back. If I got a B, it was somehow my fault for not putting in enough effort. It was a double standard that made my skin crawl, but I couldn't do anything about it. My mom would tell me to just keep trying, but even she wouldn't push back against Richard. She'd just shake her head sadly and look away. I tried to find solace outside the house, mostly by hanging out with my friends or finding odd jobs after school. The guys I hung out with weren't perfect, but they were my escape. I'd go over to my friend Jason's place after school, just to feel like I belonged somewhere, even if only for a few hours. His parents were nice enough to me, always saying hello, offering me snacks, and actually listening when I talked. At Jason's house, I felt normal. No judgment, no criticisms, just friends hanging out. It was something I never got at home. As I got older, I started working more to avoid being home. I'd take on extra shifts at the local pizza shop, staying late, scrubbing floors, and closing up just so I wouldn't have to walk into that house. The owner, Mr. Patel, was tough but fair, and he paid me a little under the table. He knew I needed the cash and didn't ask too many questions. I learned a lot from him, more than I'd ever learned from Richard. He taught me how to manage money, how to talk to customers, and how to stay calm when things got hectic. He saw something in me that my family didn't, and for once, I felt valued. At home, things continued to deteriorate. Richard and Tom's attitude toward me became more openly hostile. It was like they could sense that I was finding my way without them, and they didn't like it. They'd mock me whenever they could, with Tom snickering, "Oh look, it's Mr. Pizza Boy," whenever I came home in my uniform. I'd grit my teeth, holding back, knowing that any response would only give them more fuel. Richard would tell me I was wasting my time, that I'd never make anything of myself flipping pizzas. It was ironic, really. He'd never taught me a single thing about responsibility or independence, but he was quick to tear down any attempt I made to stand on my own. One night, things came to a head. I'd saved up some money from work, enough to buy a decent used laptop for school. I'd been working extra hours, doing everything I could to scrape together the cash, and I was proud of myself. I thought maybe, just maybe, this would be something even Richard could appreciate, a sign that I was responsible. When I came home with it, he just sneered. What a waste of money. You should have given that to your mom. She spends enough on you as it is. I was stunned. Here I was, trying to better myself, and he twisted it into something selfish, something wrong. Tom laughed, muttering under his breath about how I probably stole the money. I was furious, but I swallowed it. Years of living there had taught me that fighting back would only make things worse. After that, I became more and more determined to find my own way. I started saving up as much as I could, hiding money in a box under a loose floorboard in my room. I didn't trust anyone in that house to know about it, not even my mom. I didn't know what I was saving for exactly, but I knew it would help me escape one day. I started fantasizing about leaving, about finally having a place of my own where I didn't have to look over my shoulder or tiptoe around people who treated me like dirt. One weekend, when things were particularly bad, I decided to stay at Jason's place. I couldn't stand the thought of being home, even just to sleep. Jason's mom welcomed me in, no questions asked. She didn't know the details, but she knew enough to understand that things at home were rough. That night, lying on a sleeping bag in Jason's room, I felt a strange sense of relief. For once, I didn't feel like a burden. We talked until late, about school, girls, and dreams of getting out of our small town. Jason wanted to be a mechanic, and I told him I didn't care what I did, as long as it meant freedom. He just nodded, understanding completely. But my escapes never lasted. I always had to go back to that house eventually, back to Richard's scowls and Tom's smirks. One day, when I came home after a particularly grueling shift, I found my room ransacked. My box of saved money was gone, and I knew immediately who was behind it. I confronted Tom, demanding to know where my money was. He just shrugged, saying he didn't know anything about it. I went to my mom, desperate, but she just told me to calm down and stop accusing Tom without proof. It felt like a punch to the gut. Not only was my hard-earned money gone, but nobody cared enough to even listen to me. I was fuming, but I didn't have the energy to fight anymore. I left the house and walked aimlessly for hours, trying to calm down, trying to figure out what I'd do now. That money was my ticket out, my chance to finally break free, and now it was gone. I felt trapped all over again, like I was right back at square one. Over the next few months, I distanced myself from everyone in that house as much as I could. I'd leave before dawn and come back late at night, just to avoid seeing them. I stopped talking to my mom, too, realizing that she wasn't going to change, wasn't going to stand up for me. She'd made her choice, and I wasn't part of it. Eventually, I found myself spending more nights at friends' places, crashing on couches, avoiding the inevitable return home. My friends knew something was up, but I never went into details. I didn't want their pity. All I wanted was to finally have control over my own life. I kept working, kept saving, this time hiding my money somewhere even I barely remembered. And every day, I reminded myself that I was getting closer to freedom, even if it felt like I was crawling toward it. One day, after a long shift, I came back to find the door locked. Richard had changed the locks, and when I pounded on the door, he opened it just enough to tell me that I wasn't welcome back until I'd learned some respect. That was the last straw. I walked away, knowing that I couldn't keep going back to that place, couldn't keep letting them drag me down. I didn't know where I'd go, but anywhere was better than there. By the time I was 19, I'd grown numb to most of the shocks and disappointments in that household. Years of neglect and contempt from Richard and Tom had toughened me up, made me cold, and taught me not to expect anything from them. Still, even with my thick skin, nothing prepared me for what I learned about the will. That news hit me in a way I hadn't expected. It was like a final slap in the face, a loud, undeniable declaration that I didn't belong in this family. The whole thing started with one of our usual arguments, sparked by something petty. Richard was irritated because I hadn't taken out the trash the second he'd asked. Tom chimed in, calling me lazy, and we traded insults. Richard's temper flared, and we ended up in a shouting match, each word pushing us further into familiar, bitter territory. Then, out of nowhere, he dropped it. "Mark, you think you're entitled to something here? Think again." He spat, his voice cold and triumphant. "You're not getting a penny from me. When I'm gone, it's all going to Tom and Andrew. You've done nothing to earn it." Andrew. I hadn't thought of him in years. Richard's youngest son from a previous relationship, he lived with his mother out of state and only visited occasionally during holidays. I'd never had much of a relationship with Andrew. He'd always seemed shy and a bit distant, probably picking up on the tension in our house whenever he visited. Yet, even with his minimal connection to Richard, he still ranked higher in the family hierarchy than I did. I froze, every word Richard had said sinking into me like stones. I wasn't getting anything. Everything was going to Tom and Andrew? My mind reeled. It wasn't about the money. I'd given up on any expectations of financial help from them long ago. But the thought that he'd already decided to exclude me, that he'd gone out of his way to make sure I'd get nothing, it was like he'd erased me from the family completely. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at him, feeling a mix of anger, betrayal, and an aching sadness that I couldn't hide. Tom, sensing my shock, smirked, clearly enjoying every second of my reaction. "Oh, come on, don't look so surprised," Tom sneered. "Did you really think you were family? Just because your mom married my dad doesn't mean you get a free ride. Maybe you should start looking out for yourself, Mark." I couldn't breathe. I stormed out of the room, needing to get away, to escape before I said or did something that I couldn't take back. I went straight to my room and locked the door, trying to collect myself, to make sense of what had just happened. It was a turning point, a moment that made me see the reality of my situation more clearly than ever before. My mind raced, going over every insult, every snide comment, every cold look they'd thrown my way over the years. I realized then that no matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, I would always be an outsider. They saw me as less than them, someone unworthy, someone who didn't belong. I wasn't just an inconvenience to them, I was a burden. And they decided that when it was all said and done, I'd have nothing to show for the years I'd spent under their roof. The days that followed were a blur of anger and frustration. I barely spoke to anyone, isolating myself even further, refusing to even look at Richard or Tom. My mom sensed something was wrong, but when I tried to talk to her about it, she brushed it off. She said Richard's will was his business and that I shouldn't worry about it. "Mark, honey," she said softly, as if talking to a child, "you're young. You'll make your own way. You don't need his money." It was a painful conversation. She didn't understand, or maybe she didn't want to. She couldn't see that it wasn't about the inheritance itself. It was about the blatant rejection, the symbolic act of cutting me out, of treating me as if I wasn't worth anything. I felt like I was shouting into a void, trying to make her see, but she just couldn't. One evening, a few days after the argument, I overheard Richard and Tom talking in the living room. They didn't realize I was listening from the hallway, tucked just out of sight. They were talking about the will, laughing about it, joking about how Mark's going to be in for a rude awakening when he finds out he's not getting anything. "I can't believe he actually thought he had a chance," Richard laughed, the sound cold and mocking. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to burst in there and confront them. But I knew it would be pointless. They'd just twist it around, make me out to be the irrational one, the angry kid who didn't know his place. So I stood there, seething silently, the resentment boiling up inside me. That night, I decided it was time to take action. If they didn't want me, if they'd never seen me as part of the family, then I'd make my own way, just like my mom had suggested. I started looking for ways to earn more money, picking up extra shifts, doing odd jobs on weekends, anything to save up and get out of that house for good. Meanwhile, I could feel the tension in the house growing. Richard and Tom seemed to sense my anger, but instead of backing off, they doubled down, making snide remarks whenever they could. Tom, in particular, went out of his way to remind me of my place in the family. One day, while I was in the kitchen grabbing something to eat, he came up beside me, leaning against the counter with that smug look on his face. "You know, Mark," he said, voice dripping with fake sympathy, "you really should be grateful. You've had a free place to live all these years. Not everyone is as lucky as you." I stared at him, barely able to keep my composure. The gall of him, to act like they'd done me some huge favor by letting me stay there, when all they'd done was treat me like an unwanted guest. I wanted to lash out, to tell him exactly what I thought of him and his father, but I bit my tongue, knowing it wouldn't do any good. Instead, I walked away, retreating to my room once again, where I sat in the dark, wondering how much longer I could endure this. The walls felt like they were closing in, the weight of their contempt pressing down on me, suffocating me. I knew then that I had to leave, and soon. I couldn't wait any longer. In the weeks that followed, I made plans, quietly and methodically. I packed a few things I'd need, kept my money hidden, and tried to keep my head down. I knew that one wrong move, one slip-up, could ruin everything. I had to be careful, had to keep my anger in check, had to wait for the right moment. Finally, the day came. I waited until everyone was asleep, then slipped out of the house with my bag and my savings, leaving behind the years of hurt and betrayal. As I walked away, I didn't look back. I knew there was nothing left for me there, nothing worth holding on to. It was time to start my own life, on my own terms. After I left Richard's house, I scraped by for months. My life was a mix of part-time jobs and sleeping on friends' couches. I picked up shifts at a warehouse, did some landscaping work, even dabbled in delivering groceries, anything to pay the bills and keep moving. I'd been on my own for nearly a year when I got the call that would change everything. It was a quiet evening when my phone rang with an unknown number. I hesitated but picked up, hearing an unfamiliar voice on the other end. "Is this Mark Sanders?" the voice asked, professional and slightly cold. I confirmed, and the person introduced himself as Mr. Whitmore, a lawyer from my father's hometown. My father, who had passed away years ago, hadn't left anything for me except maybe his last name. I braced myself, unsure why a lawyer would be calling me out of the blue. "I'm reaching out regarding the estate of your aunt, Martha Sanders," he continued. Aunt Martha. I remembered her vaguely, a quiet, elegant woman who lived upstate and had occasionally sent me holiday cards as a child. She'd been my father's older sister, and from what little I knew, she was well off, though we'd rarely seen her. "I'm sorry to inform you that your aunt passed away recently," Mr. Whitmore said, his tone formal yet sympathetic. I felt a strange pang of sadness, despite barely knowing her. She was one of the last links to my father, and now she was gone too. Then, the lawyer dropped the bombshell. "She named you as the primary beneficiary in her will. You are set to inherit the majority of her estate, which, after taxes and fees, amounts to approximately $5 million. My heart stopped. I could barely process the number, let alone the fact that it was now attached to me. $5 million? I felt dizzy, my mind spinning with the enormity of what he'd just said. In one phone call, my entire reality had shifted. I tried to respond, to say something, but words failed me. The lawyer gave me a few moments, then continued, explaining that he'd need me to come to his office to finalize the paperwork. The inheritance was legitimate, and Aunt Martha had made her wishes very clear. She wanted me, her estranged nephew, to be the sole beneficiary. After I hung up, I sat there in stunned silence, the phone still clutched in my hand. My heart pounded as I tried to grasp what this meant. I'd gone from scrounging for my next meal to having enough money to change my life forever. I thought back to the years of struggle, the countless nights spent in that toxic house, feeling worthless and unwanted. And now, someone I barely knew, had chosen to give me a second chance. Over the next few days, I made the trip to Mr. Whitmore's office to sort out the details. The office was a grand old building downtown, with polished wood paneling and an air of wealth that made me feel out of place. Mr. Whitmore was a tall, impeccably dressed man with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. He greeted me with a firm handshake and led me to a conference room where a stack of paperwork awaited. As I sat across from him, he explained the logistics of the inheritance in clear, meticulous detail. Aunt Martha had been a private woman with a substantial estate, mostly investments and a few properties. She'd had no children and apparently, I was her only remaining relative. According to Mr. Whitmore, she had followed my life from a distance, even keeping up with my struggles with Richard's family. The idea that she'd cared, even remotely, was both comforting and surreal. When we reached the final page of documents, Mr. Whitmore paused, studying me over the rims of his glasses. "Your aunt was a very determined woman," he said quietly. "She was very specific about who she wanted this inheritance to go to. She believed in you, Mr. Sanders, even if others didn't." I swallowed hard, feeling a mix of gratitude and disbelief. I signed the last page with a shaky hand, still half convinced I'd wake up and realize this was all a dream. A few days later, the funds were transferred into my new bank account. I remember logging in, seeing the balance, and feeling a strange, detached sense of awe. I'd gone from counting every dollar to having a safety net most people only dream of. It was exhilarating and terrifying at the same time. I didn't want to squander this opportunity, to waste Aunt Martha's gift. She believed in me enough to leave me everything she had, and I was determined to honor that trust. With the money came new decisions, new challenges. Suddenly, people I barely knew started reaching out, relatives and acquaintances who'd never paid me any attention before. Old friends from high school wanted to catch up, and strangers online somehow got wind of my inheritance, messaging me with all sorts of investment opportunities. I quickly learned to be cautious, to protect my newfound wealth and my privacy. My first step was to secure a modest apartment, a place of my own where I could finally breathe, finally feel safe. I chose a quiet neighborhood, far from the chaos and noise I'd grown used to. My new home wasn't extravagant, just a comfortable, welcoming space where I could relax and think about the future without constantly looking over my shoulder. The peace I felt there was something I'd never experienced before. Over the next few months, I focused on building a life for myself, using the inheritance as a foundation rather than a crutch. I invested in my education, enrolling in courses that would help me pursue a stable career. I hired a financial advisor, someone Mr. Whitmore recommended, to guide me in managing the inheritance wisely. I wanted to make sure Aunt Martha's gift would last, that it would help me build a future I could be proud of. But the news of my inheritance eventually reached Richard and Tom, and that's when things took another turn. For a while, I thought I was finally free. The new apartment, the classes I'd enrolled in, and the quiet peace of having my own space made me feel like I was living in a different world, far from the resentment and drama of my past. But that peace shattered the day my mother called, her voice filled with a strange mix of forced cheerfulness and a brittle edge that set my teeth on edge. "Mark, sweetie, I heard some wonderful news," she said, dragging out the words like she was savoring them. I knew instantly that she'd found out about the inheritance. I'd been careful not to flaunt it, to live modestly, but I suppose word spreads in strange ways. My throat tightened, and I braced myself for what I knew was coming. "It must be such a relief to have some extra help," she continued, her tone sliding into a practiced sweetness that was all too familiar. "But you know, Mark, family is supposed to support each other. You're so lucky, and well, your stepfather and I, we could use a little bit of that luck, too." I gritted my teeth, trying to keep my voice calm. "Mom, Aunt Martha left that money to me. She didn't leave it to you, or Richard, or anyone else." "Oh, Mark, don't be so selfish," she replied, her tone immediately hardening. "After everything Richard has done for you, a roof over your head, food on the table, don't you think you owe him something?" My chest tightened with a surge of anger. I thought of all the times Richard had belittled me, had treated me like a burden or a stranger, and I wondered how she could possibly think I owed him anything. But I stayed calm, not willing to let her manipulate me again. That was years ago, and it's not like I was ever treated like family. "I'm sorry, but Aunt Martha wanted me to have this money for a reason. I'm not giving it away." For a few moments, there was only silence on the other end of the line. Then she sighed heavily, the weight of her disappointment palpable. "I thought you'd grown up, Mark, that you'd learned something about loyalty. Clearly, I was wrong." That conversation was just the beginning. Word spread quickly through the family, and within days, I was getting calls from everyone. Relatives I barely knew, friends from high school who suddenly wanted to reconnect, and of course, Tom. His message came in the form of a single text: "We need to talk." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him. We met at a coffee shop downtown. He arrived late, as usual, strolling in with that same smug confidence I'd grown up hating. He didn't bother with pleasantries, just sat down and leaned in, a smirk already forming on his face. "So," he started, his voice dripping with feigned casualness, "I hear you've come into a bit of money. Must be nice, huh?" I crossed my arms, keeping my expression neutral. "It's not something I want to discuss." "Come on, don't be like that," he said, leaning back with a grin. "We're family, Mark. Family shares, right? I mean, I could use a little help myself. College loans are piling up, and you know how it is. Life's expensive. And hey, since we're brothers." "Brothers?" I cut him off, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. "You never saw me as a brother, Tom. Don't act like we're close now." His smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a flash of anger, but he recovered quickly. "You're really going to be this selfish, huh? After all the support we gave you? You think you got here on your own?" That line hit me harder than I expected, but I didn't let it show. I knew he was twisting the truth, using the same tactics he and Richard had used on me for years, trying to make me feel small, indebted, and guilty. But I wasn't that kid anymore. I'd clawed my way out, and I wasn't about to let him drag me back. "Tom, I'm done," I said firmly, standing up. "I don't owe you anything. If that's all you wanted to talk about, then we're done here." I walked out before he could respond, leaving him fuming at the table. I knew he wouldn't let it go easily, and I was right. Within days, he'd spread rumors through the family, painting me as the ungrateful son who'd abandoned his own mother, who refused to share his luck with the people who'd raised him. Calls and texts came pouring in, each one more aggressive than the last. Richard even called me himself, which he hadn't done in years. His voice was cold, calculating, as he launched into a speech about family loyalty, respect, and responsibility. He talked about how much he'd sacrificed, how he'd been the father figure in my life, and how he couldn't believe I'd turned my back on them now. "Do you really think that inheritance is just yours, Mark?" he asked, his voice thick with barely contained anger. "You wouldn't be here without me. Everything you have, you owe to this family." The hypocrisy was overwhelming. I remembered all the times he'd ignored me, belittled me, made me feel like an outsider. And now, he was calling to demand money, acting like I owed him for the bare minimum he provided while treating me like a stranger. "I don't owe you anything," I replied, my voice steady. "You never treated me like family, Richard. You made that clear a long time ago." He scoffed, and I could practically see the sneer on his face through the phone. "You'll regret this, Mark. Family doesn't just go away." With that, he hung up, leaving me with a gnawing sense of dread. But I knew I'd made the right choice. I wasn't about to let them manipulate me again, no matter how much they tried to twist the truth. Things only escalated from there. Tom, not content to just spread rumors, started showing up at my apartment unannounced. He'd pound on the door, shouting about how I was selfish, how I was hoarding money that should have gone to the family. I ignored him, refusing to give in, but the constant harassment wore on me. I even considered moving, just to get away from him, but I refused to be driven out of my own life by their greed. One night, after Tom had pounded on my door for nearly an hour, I called the police. I explained the situation, told them about his demands and threats, and they agreed to send an officer over to talk to him. When he saw the police car pull up, he finally backed off, but I knew this wouldn't be the last time. The situation took a toll on my mental health. Every time my phone buzzed, I braced myself, expecting another demand, another accusation. The constant stress made it hard to focus on anything else, and I felt the weight of their resentment pressing down on me, even in my own home. I realized then that they weren't just angry, they were envious, bitter that I'd managed to escape the cycle they tried to trap me in. And now, they were trying to drag me back, using guilt, lies, and manipulation. One evening, my mom showed up at my apartment, looking worn and defeated. She asked to come in, and I hesitated, but I let her in. We sat in tense silence before she finally spoke, her voice low and pleading. "Mark, please," she whispered. "We're struggling. Richard's business isn't doing well, and Tom, he has his loans. We need help. Just a little. I know you have enough. The sight of her like that, so broken, tugged at something in me. But I couldn't forget the years of abandonment, of being treated like an outsider, of her standing by while Richard and Tom tore me down. I took a deep breath, struggling to keep my voice steady. Mom, I'm sorry, but no. Aunt Martha left that money to me because she knew I'd need it. I worked hard to get out of that situation, and I'm not going back. I'm not giving up what little security I have. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might understand. But then her expression hardened, and she looked at me with a mixture of anger and disappointment. You've changed, Mark. You're not the son I raised. She stood up and left, slamming the door behind her, leaving me feeling more alone than ever. I knew I'd done the right thing, but the weight of her words lingered, a reminder of the isolation I'd felt for so long. It was around a month after I'd last heard from my mother that I received an official-looking envelope in the mail. I almost didn't open it. After everything I'd been through with my family, I'd learned to treat anything connected to them with caution. But curiosity got the better of me, and I carefully peeled it open, my hands trembling slightly. Inside was a summons. My mother, Joan, was suing me. I read the letter 3 times, each word burning into my brain. She was suing me for family support, claiming that I owed her a share of my inheritance from Aunt Martha because of the sacrifices she and Richard had made for me over the years. The wording was twisted, filled with accusations and self-pity, painting her as a devoted mother who'd given everything for her ungrateful son. My stomach turned, a mix of disbelief and anger building inside me. After everything they'd done, after all the years of abandonment and resentment, she had the nerve to drag me into court for the money my aunt had specifically left to me. It felt like one last, desperate attempt to keep me under her thumb, to milk whatever she could from me. But this time, I wasn't about to let them manipulate me. I called Mr. Whitmore, the lawyer who'd helped with Aunt Martha's estate. When I explained the situation, he let out a low sigh. Mark, I'm so sorry you're dealing with this. Unfortunately, it's not uncommon in cases like yours. But don't worry, I'll handle it. The relief in my chest was almost overwhelming. For the first time, I felt like I had someone truly on my side. Over the next week, Mr. Whitmore investigated Joan's claims, gathering evidence and poking holes in her arguments. He assured me that the lawsuit had no real basis and that she had no legal claim to the inheritance. Aunt Martha had been thorough in her arrangements, and her wishes were crystal clear. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, Mr. Whitmore discovered something even more disturbing. During the investigation, he uncovered a letter that Joan had supposedly sent me a few weeks prior. I hadn't received it, but it was submitted as evidence in the case. A handwritten note full of accusations, guilt trips, and veiled threats. According to Joan's lawyer, this letter proved that I'd refused to support her financially, despite her repeated pleas for help. But there was a catch. I hadn't written a single response, because I'd never seen the letter. Mr. Whitmore noticed inconsistencies in the handwriting and contacted a forensic document examiner to review it. After a few days, the results came back. The letter was a forgery. Someone, likely under Joan's direction, had written it to strengthen her case against me. When Mr. Whitmore showed me the analysis report, my hands shook with rage. It was one thing to try to manipulate me, but to forge documents, to lie under oath? That was a new low, even for her. At the next court hearing, Mr. Whitmore presented our findings to the judge, exposing the forged letter and pointing out the lack of any legal foundation for Joan's claims. The judge dismissed the case, and I walked out of the courthouse feeling a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. The victory felt hollow, like a battle I shouldn't have had to fight in the first place. Afterward, I didn't hear from Joan for a while, but the damage had been done. I realized that no matter how many times I tried to cut ties, she would keep finding ways to claw her way back into my life, using guilt, threats, and even lies to try and keep control over me. The weight of it all, the years of manipulation, the constant demands, the endless feeling of never being good enough, pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I decided it was time to let go of the idea that she'd ever change, that any of them would. Richard, Tom, my own mother. They'd shown me time and time again that they saw me as nothing more than a source of money, a convenience to be exploited. I knew then that I needed to cut ties for good, to put a final end to the chapter of my life that they'd poisoned. So, I blocked their numbers, unfollowed them on every social media platform, and stopped responding to any messages they tried to send. I left no trace of my new address, no way for them to find me. It felt like ripping out pieces of myself, but I knew it was the only way I'd ever find peace. In the absence of family, I found support in unexpected places. My friends, the ones who'd stuck by me through everything, became my new family. They didn't demand anything from me. They just wanted to see me happy, to see me free from the toxic web my family had woven around me. Slowly, I began to heal, finding comfort in the simple, genuine connections I'd built over the years.